Vaccines play an important part in keeping us healthy. They trigger our body's immune system and allow it to respond more quickly in the future. Today, we're going to talk all about the immune system. So, ways in which the human body can defend itself. So, our first line of defense is the skin. And this is going to prevent most disease organisms and pathogens from entering the body, which is why we want it to be intact. And we have to worry about cuts and incisions. This is why at the doctor they rub your skin with an alcohol wipe before they give you an injection, because we don't want to be introducing any outside pathogens into our body. And the skin also contains sweat and oil secretions, which are acidic to help prevent bacterial growth, as well as hair and mucus in the nose, preventing pathogens by trapping them. We have antiseptic liquid in our tears and a strong acid in our stomach to help kill anything that might be trying to get into our body. Platelets also help by creating clotting where we do have an incision or tear in our skin to help prevent foreign objects from entering the body. And then we do have white blood cells, which attack pathogens that will break through the first line of defense and enter the body. So how do different pathogens in the environment enter the circulatory system? So some can be through our mucous membranes, so our eyes, our nose, our mouth. And we can also have bloodborne different pathogens. So this would be lots of different STIs, as well as hepatitis type infections. And they have an adverse effect on health because they interfere with the normal functioning of our body cells. So they can cause inflammation as well as damage our cells to prevent them from doing what they were intended to do. So some viruses, such as the flu or bacteria viruses such as tuberculosis, get passed from one person to another by droplets expelled in the air by an infected person. So this would be through sneezing and coughing. Now, you can get the disease by touching an object that the flu or the virus or bacteria has settled on and then touching your eyes, nose, or mouth. So this is why it's important to wash your hands with soap and water or hand sanitizer, which greatly reduces the chances of an individual getting sick. So this would be for aerosol and droplet virus and bacteria transmission. So pathogens can also enter our body through the digestive system and contaminated food or water. So this happens when food is not cooked thoroughly, could be improperly stored, or when the food is prepared in unsanitary conditions. So you can have salmonella, which is present in meat, poultry, fish, and eggs, which is why chicken has to be cooked all the way through. Cholera, which is found in dirty and untreated water. Typically, this is not an issue in developed countries. However, if there's a boil water advisory, it could be because there was an issue with the water treatment plant and they can't guarantee that it's going to be clean. Now, E. coli is also found in different meats and cheeses, and it needs oxygen to grow, which is why we can have steak that has been cooked medium rare and the inside isn't fully brought up to temperature. Because E. coli needs oxygen to grow, but ground beef, that oxygen has touched every component of it. So things like meatloaf and meatballs have to be cooked all the way through. Now, we can also find salmonella in flour, which is actually a higher risk than in eggs. So when they say, oh, don't eat cookie dough because you can get salmonella, it's not actually from the consumption of the raw eggs, but it's from the consumption of the uncooked flour. We can also get pathogens through the blood. So if the skin is punctured or cut, pathogens can enter the bloodstream before platelets can seal up the breach. So like I said, this would be like STIs as well as hepatitis viruses. Disease-causing agents can also get into us through a vector. So this would be an organism such as a parasite or a mosquito or a flea that can carry those disease-causing pathogens from one individual to another. So mosquitoes can transmit the malaria parasite as well as West Nile virus. And malaria is actually the leading cause of death and sickness in the world. So the most deadly animal in Africa isn't the hippopotamus, it's the mosquito. So now to talk a little bit more specifically about different pathogens. The first one is bacteria, which is a single-celled organism without a nucleus. And so the genetic material just floats in the cytoplasm of this single-celled organism. And bacteria can be spiral-shaped, rod-shaped, or round. Typically, they reproduce asexually by just splitting into two, and they'll grow exponentially under ideal conditions. Their life process damages human cells or produces toxins that make us feel ill. We use antibiotics to protect our body against bacteria if we have an infection, and these are drugs that kill bacteria or alter them so that our own white blood cells can kill the bacteria, and they are able to help reduce or stop the infection. It's important to take your antibiotics all the way through the prescription that you've been given, because any bacteria that aren't destroyed when you have finished your antibiotics typically are the stronger bacteria. So you need to take your full course of antibiotics to kill even the strongest of bacteria in your body if you're starting to feel better. Because if you stop taking your antibiotics 3 days into a 7-day or 5-day cycle, then those stronger bacteria are going to come back and replicate, and it will make the infection harder to get rid of the next time around. So viruses are extremely tiny particles, and they make up about 1/100th of a bacterium. So they're not considered to be living organisms because they don't grow, feed, or respire. They're generally made up of genetic material and a protein coat, like a protein layer. They reproduce by infecting the host cell. They inject their genetic material into the host cell, turning that cell into a virus-making factory. So a virus's reproductive strategy is to inject a host, and then that host will make more virus particles. So we can treat viruses using antiviral drugs, which attempt to stop the infection of cells by viruses. So they block our cells from being injected by virus genetic material. So when we're looking at the immune system, it's designed to protect us against invading organisms and other foreign matter in our bodies. And so we can just generalize these as pathogens. And there are two main parts to the immune system. The innate immune system, which is our first and second line of defense, and then our adaptive or acquired immune system. So our innate immune system is physical and chemical barriers to infection, and biological defenses, including phagocytosis by white blood cells. So this would be things like skin and mucus. Our adaptive or acquired immune system is the biological defenses provided by our white blood cells. So our innate immune system contains physical defenses, such as skin, which is a physical barrier, mucus lining our respiratory tract, cilia in the respiratory tract to trap invading particles, and things like earwax, stomach acid, nasal mucus, and tears. The chemical line of defense can include, gastric acid in our stomach, as well as humans' tears that contain enzymes which digest bacterial walls. Biological defense is a cell-mediated immunity that comes from phagocytotic leukocytes, so white blood cells that will engulf and destroy pathogens. And these will be known as neutrophils and macrophages, or big eaters. There's also a serum complement, which is special blood proteins that are produced by cells infected by viruses to prepare uninfected cells for attack. So this would be a warning sign thrown up by an infected cell to say, hey, look, there's somebody here. Prepare yourself to defend. And then inflammation is our body's general response to infection. So this is when you might experience a bit of a fever. You might have swelling and pain around an incision site. And this is due to increased blood flow to that area, bringing in phagocytes and other blood components to fight the infection. So if you have had surgery and you have an incision, there will be some swelling and pain, but that's one thing that your nurses will tell you to watch out for is pain, heat around the area, as well as increased swelling, because that could be the sign of an infection. And then we have the adapted or acquired immune system, which is antibody-mediated immunity. So this involves our body's response to a specific pathogen. And part of that response is going to produce a memory of that pathogen and our response to it, which enables us to our body to respond more quickly in the future. And this is brought about by the lymphocytes, which are one of our white blood cells. There are two types of lymphocytes. T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, which we refer to as T cells and B cells. T cells and B cells are both produced in the bone marrow, like all blood cells, but the T cells mature in the thymus gland in the thymus gland. So there are different kinds of T cells that help regulate a response to an invader. So we're going to talk about those different types of T cells. And then we have B cells, which produce antibodies, which are the chemical weapons against pathogens. And when activated, our B cells are going to undergo cellular division to produce large amounts of antibodies to that specific pathogen. And the antibodies' role is to identify specific invaders to help our body cells destroy them. So most B cells are short-lived and they simply produce antibodies. But some B cells are known as memory cells. So these are going to retain a memory of the pathogen for future reference. And memory cells are what's left in our body after we've been cleared of an infection by a virus. And they help our body fight it quickly in the future to even prevent us from getting infected with that pathogen if we come in contact with it again. Antibodies typically are Y-shaped proteins that are targeted toward a specific invader. So antibodies for one virus don't necessarily work against antibodies from a different virus. So all cells have antigen markers on them, and these are molecules on the surface of the cell that identify what that cell is. So all of your body cells have antigens that identify them as your body cells, and our body's immune response knows that our body cells are not harmful, so it doesn't produce antibodies against them. Before we're born, our immune system catalogs all of the antigens in our body, so like our body cells, our blood type, and so we can recognize ourselves against foreign invaders. However, T cells and B cells are able to recognize foreign antigens that get into our body. So this is going to cause the production of a specific antigen that can attach, a specific antibody that can attach to the specific antigen that has invaded our body. So we're going to look at the antigen-antibody complex on the next slide. So here we have an invader that has antigens on the surface of the cell. And then the antibodies that you can see are Y-shaped, attached to the antigens on that pathogen and adhere to it. Now, this allows our body to identify it. It prevents the pathogen from invading more body cells, and it actually allows those antibodies to connect to more than one antigen, which will then group them together to make them eager to phagocytize and destroy. So once the antibodies have attached themselves to the antigen, it can no longer invade host cells. Phagocytes can engulf and destroy the antigen-antibody complex and get rid of many pathogens at one time. It can bind toxins and viruses together to cause them to clump, and it prevents them from fitting onto receptor sites and infecting healthy body cells. So it really deactivates them and allows them to be more easily destroyed. So our immune response is typically slow on the first contact of a pathogen because the B cells have to be activated and antibodies still need to be produced. So typically the first time we'll come in contact with a pathogen from a disease, we'll suffer from that disease until the immune system is able to defeat the pathogen. After that point, an immunological memory is set up so that our response is quicker the next time our body comes in contact with a pathogen. So our secondary immune response is much more quick than the first time we've come in contact with a pathogen. The memory cells are able to respond quickly, and B cells are cloned rapidly to produce antibodies. Typically, we do not suffer from the disease because the immune system is able to defeat the pathogen without us even knowing about it. So when we look at this image, we can see our first response to pathogen. It took about 6 weeks for our body to build enough antibodies to defeat that disease, and then about 2 weeks for us to recover from it. Now, if we had the second exposure to the same antigens at 12 weeks, you can see quickly how many antibodies are produced and how much more antibodies are produced. And then the antibody level is actually able to stay at a much higher point than after just one exposure. So we're going to break this down into the immune response step by step to different harmful pathogens. So the immune response begins when a white blood cell called a macrophage encounters a pathogen and consumes it. All the while that the other pathogens are looking for other cells to infect. So the first thing that happens, okay, so the pathogens got into our body, and one of them is going to be consumed by a macrophage who knows that it's not one of our body cells. Macrophage is going to digest that pathogen and display the antigens from that pathogen on its surface. So now that we can see on the macrophage, we have those black antigens that are demonstrating that it's an infected cell. And we can also note that in this picture, nearby cells have also been infected with the pathogens that got into our body. So now a T cell, known as a helper T cell, recognizes that this macrophage is displaying the antigen of a pathogen. So it's going to bind onto that macrophage. So this is our helper T cell. The helper T cell is then going to send out a chemical signal which allows for intracellular communication. So we can look at this is a helper T cell yelling, "Help! Help! Help! There's invaders." So that helper T cell activates the uh, B cells that get the chemical message to begin to multiply. Some B cells are going to produce antibodies, which are going to be specific for that antigen on the macrophage. So we have the helper T cell that calls for help. B cells will come and make antibodies. So the antibodies released by the B cells bind to the antigens on the surface of the free-floating pathogens, as well as the macrophages that have been engulfed and are displaying the pathogen antigen, as well as the antigens on any affected cells. So these antibodies can often bind to make more than one pathogen group together, which makes it easier for the macrophages to engulf them. The killer T cells will also begin to digest holes and host cells that have been infected with the pathogen, which stops viral reproduction. So the antibodies will bind on to infected cells, which allows for killer T cells to destroy them so that they don't become hosts for the pathogen in our body. Finally, as the infection is brought under control, activated T and B cells are going to be turned off by suppressor cells. So this is so our immune response doesn't continue on indefinitely. However, a few memory B cells are going to remain behind to respond quickly if the same pathogen attacks again. There also are memory T cells that retain a blueprint of the protein markers of the invading pathogen. So if this pathogen enters the body again, memory T cells quickly mobilize the B cells to manufacture the correct antibody. So the antigen is going to be destroyed before it's established, which is why if we come in contact with the same disease again, we often don't get sick. And if we get a little bit sick, it's because our body was able to respond rapidly. Looking at vaccines, which are a way that we can protect our body against viral illnesses. So a vaccine is a substance that stimulates the body to produce antibodies for a particular pathogen. So vaccines stimulate the primary immune response. Vaccines contain antigens from the pathogen causing a disease, but it's normally altered in such a way so it does not cause the disease. So either it's an inactive virus, or it's part of a virus, or it's been a denatured virus, or it's just part of the protein that surrounds the virus. After our primary immune response is complete, those memory T cells are produced and they remain ready for a quick response if that same antigen enters again. So we get vaccine for things like chickenpox and hepatitis regularly in our immunization programs. Antibiotics are different than vaccines because we don't take them before we have an illness, but we take them after we've been infected with a bacteria. So typically antibiotics are chemicals that have been extracted from other organisms, which is typically fungi, and they're able to kill bacteria. They were first discovered by Alexander Fleming when he had a very lazy housekeeper, the story is. So he had a sandwich in his lab that didn't get cleaned up. And when the mold from the sandwich grew onto the petri dish, Alexander Fleming noticed that it was able to push back the bacteria that was growing in that petri dish. So eventually he was able to isolate the component from penicillin, from that mold that was able to kill a bacteria, and it became penicillin. So occasionally, our immune system fails to recognize its own antigens and attacks our own cells as if they are foreign cells. So this is called an autoimmune disorder. So some examples are rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and type 1 diabetes. Allergies are a little bit different from an immune disorder because it's an exaggerated response to a harmless substance, such as dust or pollen. So it's not our body reacting against itself, but it's our body overreacting to something that is coming into our body, but it is harmless. So some forms of asthma are allergic reactions. So some people have asthma that is an allergic reaction. So their asthma is triggered by foreign particles. And unfortunately, in Canada, food allergies are becoming much more common, which makes it difficult for people who have food allergies to consume food safely kind of in public spaces. So that's our lesson on the immune response, both primary and secondary. I hope you enjoyed it.